dirty work. Oh yeah.
Hello, it's me again. Great news. I lied, because 4 months ago, I told you this. So I'll be back in exactly 2 weeks. Yes, so help me God, 2 weeks. With a review and comparison to the original of Mafia Definitive Edition. Didn't exactly pan out that way, but there's a good reason for that, because I am an idiot. You see, I had a plan. In my infinite stupidity, I thought it would be smart to squeeze in a Diablo 4 review before the release of the Vessel of Hatred on October the 8th. But then something dark, twisted, and horrible happened that upended the course of my life forever. Or at least the last 4 months. I'll spare you the gory details, but long story short, my wisdom teeth, which I should have had removed years ago, suddenly decided to become infected. The dentist had a nice waiting list, and after a couple of weeks, I got immune to every conceivable painkiller on the planet. So once again, my sincere apologies for the late upload. But if it makes you feel any better, the last 4 months were spent by me marching up and down my apartment, screaming, yelling, and crying, while my own mouth literally tried to kill me. I survived, however, and now it's my turn to return the favor and kill my mouth. Well, let's just start with the video. Earlier last year, during one of the million Jeff Keighley gaming shows, they announced a new Mafia game. And then a few weeks ago, during another one of those Jeff Keighley gaming shows, they showed the full trailer. Mafia, the Old Country, is a prequel to, every Mafia game, but mostly the original one from 2002, which was developed by Illusion Softworks. It was such a great, unique, and successful game that it spawned an equally awesome sequel called Mafia 2. And there was also a third game. However, just a few years ago, in 2020, Mafia got a full-blown remake, which was baptized as the Definitive Edition. But was it really, though? To answer that question, like always, we have to go back to the very beginning. And this time, that takes us to the beautiful city of Brno in the Czech Republic.
You're not gonna believe this. He killed 16 Czechoslovakians. Guy was an interior decorator.
It was right here, in 1997, that two ambitious young men called Petr Wojcicka and Jan Kudera, who somehow doesn't have a picture of himself anywhere on the internet, started their own development studio. Illusion Softworks was born. Their first game was Lurid Land, a kinda weird-looking but charming puzzle platformer. We play as one of two wizards called Limbolo or Rupito, who tried to defeat their evil counterpart Cerilius, who's trying to take over the world. The game featured 60 levels, and I don't know, but it kinda reminds me of this little guy. What happened to him? Anyway, Lurid Land was a moderate success and scored decently, around 70% by the local critics, but didn't seem to find widespread appeal.
So no one told you life was gonna be this way.
Now, the late 90s are widely known for two things and two things only: disgustingly creepy toys like Furbies and point-and-click adventure games. So in 1998, when the Furbies were aggressively trying to take over the world, Illusion Softworks launched their first and only adventure game, Leto z Oscarem. At least I think that's how you pronounce it. In English, that becomes Summer with Oscar. As the title might suggest, we play as Oscar, who's so bad at school that his parents send him to live with his grandparents in a small rural town.
Jistě. Stejně jako tvůj otec. Ten už se narodil s oběma rukama levýma.
And, yeah. The game had to compete with certified classics like Broken Sword 2 and Monkey Island 3, so it once again didn't really break through the borders and was more of a local success. But then everything changed, because in 1999, Illusion Softworks put out the tactical third-person shooter Hidden and Dangerous. We play as a four-man squadron of British SAS operatives, completing a number of important missions during World War I. The special thing about Hidden and Dangerous was that the perspective could be switched between third and first person, giving it a more tactical feel than most of its competitors at the time. During development, Illusion Softworks hired a young graphical artist named Daniel Vavra, which, as they would soon discover, was one of the best things they could have ever done. Hidden and Dangerous was a big hit, and even released an expansion called Fight for Freedom. After that expansion hit the market, Daniel Vavra started working on a secret project, while the rest of Illusion Softworks developed their next game called Flying Heroes. Released in the year 2000, this was a mix between Crimson Sky and Quake, so we basically flew through various environments, picking up ammo and power-ups along the way, while taking out our opponents. It supported online play for up to 8 players and was a moderate success, but nothing compared to what was to come next. Because on August 29 of 2002, this still pretty small development studio from Eastern Europe released one of the best open world games of all time. Written, directed, and designed by Daniel Vavra, Mafia, the City of Lost Heaven, was a revelation. A full open world of the likes we'd never seen before. Taking place in the 1930s, the City of Lost Heaven was modeled after Chicago, with era-accurate cars, buildings, and weapons. GTA 3 launched a year earlier and offered a similar interactive open world in a current-day setting with a lot of wacky characters, mechanics, and violence. But Mafia was all about realism. Cars had specific damage models and would break down accordingly to the actions you took as a player and the way you crashed into objects. You had to switch gears to accelerate or drive backwards. There were realistic speedometers, and if you went over the speed limit, cops with actually good AI would chase you, stop you, and give you a ticket. The whole City of Lost Heaven was divided up into multiple distinct districts, each with their own feel and inhabitants. There was even an airport, a racetrack, and a countryside where certain missions would take place, because that's exactly what made Mafia even more special and unique. Its mission structure. In practically every open world game out there, the story serves the city or whatever location the game takes place in. However, in Mafia, it's the exact opposite. The City of Lost Heaven exists to serve the story of Mafia. You can't just deviate from the main objective and go on a killing spree killing a bunch of prostitutes, after which you'll pay a fee at the hospital and you're good to go again. No. Every aspect of Lost Heaven is handcrafted and serves a purpose. The whole city exists to help the developers tell their story in the most realistic, immersive, and interesting way possible. And Mafia's story is a great one. It all begins where it ends, in 1938, where we meet Tommy Angelo, who's walking to a bar where he's about to meet up with Detective Norman. It immediately becomes clear that Tommy is willing to become a rat and sell out the Salieri crime family. But the reasoning behind it all is the story where the actual game takes place in. Tommy's tale begins 8 years earlier, in 1930, where he's just a poor taxi driver who suddenly gets ambushed and threatened by 2 unsavory figures who jump into his cab and tell him to drive. These 2 turn out to be Paulie and Sam, 2 members of the Salieri crime family. They compensate him for his efforts, and Tommy goes on his merry way. But the very next day, while driving his cab around picking people up and dropping them off, he gets attacked by the assailants of the previous night, who turn out to be members of the competing Morello family. This forces Tommy to reluctantly join the Salieri clan. He's welcomed by the Don himself, Paulie and Sam, who we met earlier, and Frank Coletti, the Don's consigliere. 2 years of racketeering pass, and in 1932, Tommy accompanies Sarah, the daughter of bartender Luigi, home while they get attacked by a gang of street thugs. After beating them up, Tommy and Sarah end up sleeping together, which is the start of their relationship that'll result in a wedding and 2 kids. The next day, the Don orders Tommy and Paulie to take care of the gang, and they end up killing most of them. However, it turns out the leader of the gang was a corrupt city official's son, who now aligns himself with Morello, which of course has huge consequences for the Salieri family and ripples throughout the years and therefore the rest of the game. During the rest of Tommy's story, we focus on the Salieri feud with the Morello family through a bunch of unique and interesting missions, each one raising the stakes and making Tommy question more and more if he's in the right line of business. And that's the beautiful part of the original Mafia. Tommy isn't your typical wise guy or mobster. He's not a born killer who needs violence to thrive, but rather someone who accidentally got wrapped up into this whole mess. Nothing signifies this more than the mission where we have to kill one of Morello's informants in a nearby brothel. It turns out the informant is Michelle, one of Sarah's friends, but instead of killing her, Tommy lets her go, tells her to disappear, and starts to question his own morality. This sends him down a path of doubt and fear, which humanizes him in a way that few games or movies really can. It's a unique premise and perspective we don't see all that often in stories like this, and the way its creator Daniel Vavra slowly builds up to it is masterfully done. The many side characters like Polly, Sam, Frank, or even Adon himself are more caricatures. Even though they have their own distinct quirks and motivations, you never really get to know them, and they're mostly there to serve Tommy's evolution. This makes it so that the mission structure feels a bit disjointed from time to time. You basically move from one situation to the other, but there's never really time to reflect or talk about what just happened. That doesn't detract from how great the overall story really is though. But games like this generally live or die by their gameplay, and luckily, Mafia manages to even excel in that department. Once again, realism is what it's all about. You can't just walk into a room of enemies and go full on Doom or act like Max Payne because you'll be dead in seconds. There's no automatic snap cover system in place, so you're in complete control of Tommy at all times and have to manually crouch behind objects or corners to get into cover or to even improve your aim. This is necessary because the weapons have actual realistic recoil. So if you go in guns blazing, Tommy misses every enemy he's trying to hit and dies himself. This especially becomes apparent when you're handling a machine gun or a Tommy gun. There's a number of handguns, machine guns, rifles, and shotguns, and they all feel different and distinct from each other. The enemy AI also uses different pathways, so every encounter feels unique, and even replaying the same sections nets different results and requires new strategies. All of this makes the combat actually challenging and difficult, but it pales in comparison to the driving parts of the game. Once again, realism is at the forefront here. You're not going to quickly speed away in cars and take 90-degree corners because the shifting is done manually. This makes for much slower driving mechanics, but like everything else in Mafia, you're always in complete control. You also never want to go too fast because the damage you take when hitting an object not only completely wrecks your car, but also damages Tommy. Now there is an option to drive automatic, but it never really feels right because the cars simply weren't that fast back then. So taking both the combat and the driving into consideration, you might say that the original game on PC back in 2002 was pretty damn difficult. Not only that, but there was also no difficulty slider. So if you got stuck at a particular difficult section, you got stuck. And this is where Mafia traumatized an entire generation and made them realize they weren't the pro gamers they thought they were, myself included. I'm talking, of course, about the infamous racetrack mission. At a certain point in the first half of the game, Tommy has to fill in for a racer and take the number 1 spot on the board in order for the rest of the family to win big. Now remember, there's no difficulty slider and every tiny mistake would result in a loss. So you had to race perfectly. 5 laps, perfectly. Not only that, but your opponents were tough as hell and wouldn't make any mistakes either. Many keyboards all around the globe were smashed during this racetrack mission. But apart from that, Mafia the City of Lost Heaven was a treasure. From story to combat to the driving and even the infamous race, it was all beautiful, delivered with care and passion oozing out of every gameplay mechanic. Hell, they even thought of a free ride mode where you could just cruise to the city and enjoy the many sides the game had to offer without any mission structure. And that's not even mentioning the fantastic soundtrack, with once again era-specific tunes, making every drive more enjoyable. Mafia the City of Lost Heaven truly had it all, and was the tremendous worldwide success Illusion Softworks had been hoping for, and genuinely deserved. Now just like Tommy, I grew up pretty poor. We had a large family of 5, and my dad had a good and steady job, but sending 3 kids to college and paying alimony to a wife who took off to start an offline OnlyFans was taking its toll on the poor man. We could afford rent and food, but fun things like the internet or the dentist weren't exactly present at this moment in time. So during the summer of 2002, when I was the only kid left living under his roof, I figured it was time to step up and help him out. Unlike Tommy, not by racketeering or murdering people, but by taking a job at our local chocolate factory. Sadly, no Willy Wonka, Oompa Loompas, or rivers made of candy, but an angry 300-pound 50-year-old co-worker called Maurice, who would occasionally yell at me in some foreign language I presume was meant to be French. Times were tough, but the one thing that kept me going that summer was Mafia, the City of Lost Heaven. My PC at the time could barely run it, but I somehow managed to trick it into working even though it shouldn't. So during the day, I slaved away making chocolate for Maurice, but my nights were spent gloriously stuttering away in 20 FPS while I was a gangster in the City of Lost Heaven. That is, until I reached that infamous racetrack mission. The first 2 nights I was a bit frustrated, but managed to keep my cool. The third night, however, it broke me. I wasn't gonna go to sleep until I finally beat this mission. So as the hours ticked away and my 6 AM chocolate factory alarm loomed closer, I became more and more determined to finish this until the bitter end. And just then, when I was about to lose all hope at 5:30 AM on a hot Wednesday summer morning, it happened. I finally got that #1 spot and could continue the actual game. The exhilarating feeling of victory is something I'll never forget. Dark Souls, Elden Ring, no problem, but this race, man, I've never experienced anything like it since. Now, I wasn't gonna let Maurice take that away from me, so I did the sensible thing and quit my summer job at the chocolate factory. Of course, I was once again yelled at, but it didn't matter because I was a racetrack driver. Sadly, the whole purpose of this job was to help my dad out, so money still needed to come in. So like every dumb 90s kid, I did the unthinkable. Back then, PC games came in these huge cardboard boxes that were taking up a lot of space, and I figured these boxes would be around forever, so why not just sell them? Warcraft 2, StarCraft, Half-Life, Command & Conquer, Red Alert 2, The Elder Scrolls Arena and Daggerfall, System Shock, Fallout 1 and 2, Baldur's Gate, Planescape Torment, but also my entire LucasArts and Sierra collections, because why not? So King's Quest 1 to 5, Space Quest 1 to 3, the original boxes of Monkey Island 1 and 2, the list went on and on. I got a whopping $100 at our local game store for the entire lot, and never regretted it for 1 second. Never, ever. After the worldwide success of Mafia, Daniel Vavra and his team immediately began working on a sequel, while the rest of Illusion Softworks worked on other properties. Because only 1 year later, in 2003, Hidden and Dangerous 2 hit the market. Everything that made the first game such a big hit was refined, and this time they added stealth mechanics in which you could steal enemy uniforms and get behind enemy lines unnoticed. At launch, there were a couple of annoying bugs, but that didn't stop Hidden and Dangerous 2 from becoming an even bigger success than its predecessor. And later that very same year, Illusion Softworks teamed up with another developer called Pterodon and released the tactical first-person shooter Viet Cong. Now, as the title might suggest, you play as a United States Special Force Green Beret deployed deep into the jungle of Vietnam to fight the commies and get PTSD. The single-player campaign offered various missions including typical run-and-gun ones, but also required a decent amount of stealth and tactical insight. The multiplayer, however, went up to 64 players per match, which was pretty significant at the time. The reviews and sales for Viet Cong were pretty mid, but did further advance Illusion Softworks' plans to expand their worldwide growth. And they worked fast because only a year later, in 2004, they released 2 expansion packs, one for Hidden and Dangerous 2 and one for Viet Cong, but also a console port for Mafia, the City of Lost Heaven. It was now finally available on the PlayStation 2 and the OG Xbox with a difficulty slider. Many controllers would still be broken during the infamous racetrack mission, but at least no one would have to quit their wonderful job at the chocolate factory. And again, in that time, game development was moving fast, so in 2005, only 2 years after the release of the original, Illusion Softworks once again teamed up with Pterodon and released Viet Cong 2. This time, the game would not only offer us the perspective of the American forces, but also gave us the option to see things from the Vietnamese side, where we played as a young recruit fighting before and after the Tet Offensive. Once again, the scores and sales were pretty middling, but that didn't stop Illusion Softworks and that other developer from making their collaboration permanent, as they became one studio. And while Daniel Vavra and his team were still working on the sequel to the worldwide success that was Mafia, something happened that would change the course of the studio forever. And as we've seen plenty of times before, it wasn't something positive. Money is nice, and having it is even nicer. So on January 8th of 2008, while the development of Mafia 2 was well on its way, Illusion Softworks was bought by 2K Interactive. As a result of this acquisition, the studio was renamed to 2K Czech. The new management didn't exactly gel well with a lot of the developers, including Daniel Vavra. So while Mafia's 2 script had been done for years and the development of the actual game was well underway, 2K decided to make a couple of alterations. They changed the mission structure, the enemy AI, which we'll get into later, cut corners wherever they could, and even meddled with the ending. This naturally wasn't to Daniel's liking, but it wasn't until they also rejected his script for Mafia 3 that he was truly finally done. In 2009, a full year before Mafia 2 even saw the light of day, Daniel Vavra left the studio he helped to put on the map and took a bunch of loyal employees with him. That didn't stop 2K Czech from releasing Mafia 2 in the summer of 2010 though. Taking place nearly a decade after the first game, Mafia 2 changed its setting from Lost Heaven to the beautiful city of Empire Bay, clearly inspired by New York. This is where we meet Vito Scaletta and his childhood friend Joe Barbaro, who in 1943 decide to do a little robbery. Joe manages to get away, but sadly Vito gets caught and given the choice to either go to jail or enlist in the infantry to go kick some ass in Europe. We next meet Vito in Sicily, where he is in fact kicking ass, but when he finally returns home in 1945, things have changed. Joe joined the Clemente family and introduces Vito to a couple of his new friends and provides him with work. However, it's not long before Vito gets arrested again, and this time, there is no war to be fought, so he's sent to jail for a whopping 6 years. After he gets released and basically lost everything, Vito is angry and ready to do whatever it takes to gain money and power. His life descends in turmoil as he tries to navigate the mobster lifestyle and loses more of himself along the way. Throughout the entire game, Joe is at his side, and we really get to appreciate the friendship and bond between these two, which form the heart of the story. Combat was more refined, with an actual cover system, and the driving, although less realistic, felt more engaging and interactive. The city of Empire Bay was not only beautiful, but we saw it change over the course of the many years the game took place in, and even over several seasons. Starting out in the winter, close to Christmas, gives Mafia 2 a special kind of magic few games manage to portray well. Having it then shift to spring, summer, and fall really makes you feel the passage of time. The way cars handle differently according to the weather is something truly magnificent. The overall narrative is one of regret, anger, greed, friendship, loyalty, and betrayal, but the ending was somewhat divisive. Now don't get me wrong, Mafia 2 was a fantastic game, one of my personal favorites, and a great sequel. But you essentially work up the entire game to reach the conclusion, and then it simply ends in a pretty anticlimactic way. So when the game launched on the PS3, Xbox 360, and PC in the summer of 2010, it was met with pretty mixed reviews, which in my opinion could have been much higher if 2K didn't clearly cut out a lot of content. It's something Daniel Vavra would later comment on when people ask him how much content was exactly cut from the final version. His answer was, a lot. Not long after, in 2011, 2K Czech tried something radically different and released Top Spin 4, a tennis game for the PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, and the Wii. It was noticeable that it could be played with the PlayStation Move controller and of course the Wii modes, but not the Xbox Kinect. Reviews were actually pretty good, but sadly that didn't stop what was about to happen. Because like with every other acquisition, later that year, 2K laid off about 25% of its employees at both the Brno and the Prague offices. The weird thing about this is that only a few months later, in 2012, 2K started hiring new developers for a secret project that wasn't really all that secret. Mafia 3 had been in development for a while, when 2 years later, in 2014, 2K suddenly decided to completely shut down their office in Prague. Numerous reports came out that creative differences between the dev teams and 2K management led to this decision. Apparently, Mafia 3 was rebooted a whopping 7 times between 2011 and 2013, which made 2K move the entire development of the game to the US. Hangar 13, based in Novato, California, was the new primary developer of the game, and everyone else, except for 10 developers who got brought over, were laid off. Luckily for them, Daniel Vavra hadn't been sitting still. In 2011, he founded War Horse Studios and brought over a lot of developers who were originally laid off by 2K. They went on to make one of the greatest RPGs of all time in Kingdom Come Deliverance, which released in 2018. Hangar 13, however, kept working on another game, and on October the 7th of 2016, Mafia 3 finally saw the light of day. Set nearly 2 decades after the controversial ending of its predecessor, we find ourselves in New Bordeaux, a city clearly based on New Orleans. We play as Lincoln Clay, a Vietnam veteran who returns home after the war only to get betrayed and have his entire family wiped out by the Italian mob. Lincoln teams up with CIA agent Donovan and 3 other local mob bosses to try and take down Sal Marcano. One of his new associates is Vito Scaletta, our beloved protagonist from Mafia 2. Districts played a huge part in Mafia 3 and had you distribute your wealth to one of your 3 companions in order to destabilize the region. Now, since it's set in the late 60s, the soundtrack for this game is probably the best I've ever heard. Ranging from the Beach Boys to Johnny Cash and from Elvis to Jimi Hendrix. Truly fantastic stuff. The cars were once again era accurate, the story was amazing, the characters interesting, and on paper, this should have been one of the greatest games ever made. But the one thing that wasn't good was the actual game. The realism from the previous 2 titles was basically thrown out of the window and made room for a more arcadey style of gameplay. The shooting and cover mechanics were simplified and streamlined, so it was all too easy to get headshots with any gun you wanted. But the most damning aspect of Mafia 3 was the boring mission design and the bland open world. That's right, the city no longer served the story, but it was the other way around. You basically moved from one warehouse to the other, taking everyone out, grabbing their cash, giving it to your companions, and that was basically it. Over and over and over again. It made for a boring slog with no character progression system, so the only reason you kept playing it was for the fantastic story, which was hidden behind endless nonsense. Unsurprisingly, the reviews were mixed and Mafia 3 was quickly forgotten about. It wasn't that the game was bad. Despite the usual many bugs that plagued the launch, it was functional, which is more than what we usually get these days. But it was just so disappointing in every aspect. So 4 years later, on May 13, 2020, when Hangar 13 announced they were remaking Mafia the City of Lost Heaven, I had 0 expectations. Mafia was already perfect, so why were they messing with it? They claimed it would be updated to modern standards, which is never a good sign, and have a more cinematic feeling. I only had one thought going through my mind.
It won't be cinematic.
Not only that, but through a series of tweets, the creator of Mafia, Daniel Vavra, made clear he had nothing to do with this remake. On Twitter, he wrote, "Since everybody asks me about it all day, I didn't work on it. I don't expect much from it. Nobody told me anything about it. I don't know anything about it. Nobody paid me anything for it. My involvement is 0. I just wrote and directed the original." In that same series of tweets, he also went deeper into the changes 2K made to Mafia 2, which ultimately led to his departure at the studio. On Twitter, someone asked, "The opponents in the second game were fully scripted? I have never noticed that, but then again I only played it once or twice, unlike The Lost Heaven with 10 plus playthroughs. I get what you were saying and expect the remastered game not to live up to the hype." To which Daniel replied, "Try to play the levels from 2 twice in a row. 90% of the time, everything is the same. In the first game, every shootout is different and non-linear. You can play hide and seek with enemies at the airport. Of course they are spawned during some triggers, but then act mostly independently." Now all of this got long-term fans of the series very concerned, myself included. To not consult the creator of the original was a big mistake, so I kinda made up my mind right there and then. There's no way the developers who bungled Mafia 3 could do one of my favorite games of all time justice.
Fucking quiz!
Luckily, I was wrong. Mafia the Definitive Edition is a tour de force, a beautiful, majestic, and respectful update to one of the most unique games of all time that deviates from the source material in a few meaningful and annoying ways. That doesn't mean that it's better or worse than the original, but to illustrate that, we'll go over a couple of key differences between the two to highlight what I mean. Starting up the game, you can choose between 4 difficulty settings, and unlike in many other games, they actually matter here, because one of them is the classic difficulty. And this brought me all the way back to those traumatic events of that summer in 2002, when I stayed up all night to become a certified racetrack driver. The classic difficulty option basically gives you the game as it first released on PC, with cops who stop you if you go over the speed limit, harder combat, less health, and of course that goddamn race. But more on that in a little bit. Hearing the beautiful opening theme while the camera swoops over the city of Lost Heaven immediately made me feel like I was in for something special. It's a funny thing what some of these remakes do, because they trick your memory into thinking the game always looked this way. But the opening cutscene is also where the first realization comes in that this remake changes a couple of things. For instance, in the original, it was Tommy who was on his way to meet Detective Norman, but here, it's the other way around. It's a subtle difference, but if you've played the original, it immediately makes sure you know the remake will deviate in certain ways. And personally, I love that, because it kept me on edge throughout the entire game and enhanced my experience as a returning player. And this is where Mafia Definitive Edition truly shines. Apart from the obvious graphical overhaul, which looks absolutely stunning by the way, it's the subtle touches to the overall story and its characters that make this a whole new experience. Everything, apart from the actual gameplay, feels more fleshed out with additional scenes, dialogue, and character depth. Take Sarah for instance, Tommy's love interest. In the first game, she gets introduced when Luigi asks Tommy to walk her home, while here in the remake, she's already there way before that in the racetrack mission. More importantly, she feels like an actual person here. When Tommy walks her home and beats up the thugs outside of her apartment, the mission structure is largely the same, but the way it ends is much more endearing and humanized. Tommy and Sarah simply fall asleep on the couch. It makes their relationship start off on a more realistic base, which makes the emotional parts later on have way more impact. Tommy's 2 friends, Polly and Sam, also get lots more character development, and their personalities each get to shine in their own way. In the original, Polly comes off as a bit of a psychopath who shoots first, seems to enjoy it, and then doesn't even ask questions later. It's a pretty stereotypical depiction of the loose cannon or the wild card. In the Definitive Edition, however, we learn that he knows that he's different and how lonely that makes him feel. He realizes that he doesn't have it in him to grow up or start a family, so he'll always be an enforcer and nothing more. The people around Polly all have bigger dreams and motivations, while he lacks a purpose, which brings him on the verge of depression. It makes him lash out, become violent and irrational. Initially, Polly starts out teaching Tommy the ropes, but near the end of the game, those roles are almost reversed, where Tommy takes up the mantle of the older brother, trying to protect the younger one. Meanwhile, Sam claims all the years of violence aren't really getting to him, but they are. Sam starts out as a responsible, caring friend who's showing Tommy the ropes, but also isn't scared to lay down the truth. One of the major changes between the original and the Definitive Edition is the mission involving Michelle. As we've been over before, Michelle was a friend of Sarah's who became a turncoat for the Morello family, but in the Definitive Edition, she's Sam's friend. He asks Tommy to spare her and to tell her to get out of town instead of killing her. So in the original, this is the point where Tommy showed his humanity, while here, it's actually Sam who doesn't follow orders and asks Tommy to do the same. However, throughout the course of the game, Sam slowly starts to disassociate himself. At one point he even tells Tommy to simply not think about the horrible things they're doing, because that's the only way to live with themselves. His psychological descent into becoming a loyal soldier who lacks the ability to see the bigger picture is extremely captivating to watch. Having both Polly and Sam take over certain aspects of Tommy's personality of the original game makes it so that he's more of a wise guy in the Definitive Edition. He no longer reluctantly joins the Salieri family, and although his first initial kill provokes the same traumatic response as it does in the original, he soon becomes a soldier with an endless body count to his name. Not in that way. This becomes most apparent in a beautiful scene shared between Frank and Tommy at the midway point in the game. The scene is in both games, but gets greatly expanded upon in the Definitive Edition. Frank's concerned about the way Tommy spends his money and advises him to invest it instead. Tommy obviously respects him and listens carefully to what he has to say, but it doesn't seem to really get through to him. This is once again a great example of where a scene deviates from the original and becomes so much more in the remake. In the original, this is where it ends, but here it continues. It's my favorite moment of both games and something I'm positive we'll see return in the prequel, The Old Country, because this is the moment where Frank tells Tommy the story of how he met Don Salieri. When Frank was 8 or 9 years old and living in Sicily, he had a greyhound dog who they used to bet on during the races they set up. She was unbeatable and never lost until one day she did. She went into heat, escaped from the yard, and got pregnant. Frank makes sure Tommy realizes that he's the dog, and flashing around his money makes it so that everyone who sees it wants to screw him over. Once the point is made, he tells Tommy that he's smarter than both Polly and Sam and that he's the future of the family. Tommy asks what happened to the dog, and it turns out Don Salieri tried to drown it, which made Frank break his nose. It's a very simple scene, but the quiet facial animations and the slow build-up make it so that you actually feel for every character involved, even the ones not in the actual scene. We find out why Frank is the way that he is, how ruthless Don Salieri can be, how the family views Polly and Sam, and how Tommy isn't the invulnerable protagonist we might have thought he was. In the original game, we only got to know Tommy through his eyes, but here, his character development happens through other people, which brings in a whole new and fresh perspective to the world of Mafia. Where the first game was ultimately a story about greed and how to get what you want, the Definitive Edition is a story about family, friendship, and how to keep what you have. So in the narrative department, the Definitive Edition greatly expands on the original game. The gameplay, however, is more restricted. There's a snap cover system in play, so all the shooting segments are much easier. There's simply less strategy involved, especially since the AI works like it did in Mafia 2 and 3, on a predetermined set of pathways, so your enemies will always be and run to the same spots no matter how many times you replay it. Even the few scenes with melee combat or the couple of stealth scenes in the game are so easy that you can hardly screw them up. Of course, playing the game on classic difficulty ramps it all up a notch, but the enemy AI will always react the same way, even if they have more hit points, better aim, and do more damage. For instance, during the restaurant combat scene, you seamlessly move from the interior to an alleyway out to the street where you take out a dozen enemies. Med cabinets are all over the place, which quickly heal Tommy, but the problem is that the enemies always react the same way, and the use of a Tommy gun makes quick work of them. It all looks great, but it doesn't feel right because you're hardly in any real danger. Headshots basically take care of everyone, and even though there's still some recoil left on the gun work, it's all a bit too streamlined and easy. The driving can still be done either manually or automatic, but shooting from inside the car has also been greatly streamlined. You can no longer target different aspects of enemy cars, and you're pretty much locked to a circle that'll just shoot the car until it breaks down. This makes it so that you have way less control over Tommy and the actual game. The infamous racetrack mission is also back, but this time is actually pretty easy. On normal difficulty, to be clear. It's now 3 laps instead of 5, and you don't really have to try to win. That's because the damage models on the cars and Tommy himself are much more forgiving. No longer does a crash during the race or even out in the open world automatically signify death. As you can see, the whole thing does look beautiful though. This is also noticeable in the audio department during the segment where both the announcer as well as the music give the whole thing an extra level of immersion and cinematic flair. And that's exactly what makes this Definitive Edition so special. It's clear that they mostly focused on telling a predetermined story, and the gameplay segments were inserted so that the developers could carefully guide you to the most cinematic viewpoints. They've tried to make you, or Tommy, look as cool as possible, and even though that's great, it does come at a cost or less player agency. Everything is remade from the ground up, so the locations look more realistic and gritty. You'll especially notice this during the shootout at the farmhouse, where the rain keeps pouring down as more and more enemies try to take you out, while the place is beautifully lit up by the different headlights, gunfire, the moon, and the stars. The same goes for the interiors, like inside the barn where the rest of the shootout takes place. While you're chucking Molotovs at enemies and take them out as carefully as possible, their shadows and silhouettes dance on the floors and walls below and around them, until blood spatters and their bodies are the only things left in the place. Even quieter locations like the Salieri bar look authentic, but at the same time lived in, and the same goes for the courtyard where a lot of the starter missions take place. The city of Lost Heaven itself got a beautiful makeover, but more importantly is that there are now more options to get around. Not literally, I mean the original had a full train system which is absent here in the remake, but there are more alleyways, shortcuts, and even more bridges to get around. Different weather types or times of day make for a new and exciting atmosphere. When it's raining, you can feel it pouring down on the car, and even though it doesn't really impact the driving to the extent like it should have, it still gives it just that little extra cinematic beauty that makes you feel immersed. The city districts also got a new overhaul so that something like Chinatown actually looks like Chinatown now. Again, this helps immensely with the immersion and breathing life into the story. It always makes sure that your surroundings serve the narrative and not the other way around. The soundtrack and music in the game are a bit mixed. There were clearly some issues with getting the rights to every radio song used in the original, so while driving, you'll notice a few of them are missing, including the most famous one. The main theme got a beautiful makeover to make it sound more epic and bombastic. The new voice actors do a tremendous job giving their characters extra depth and emotion. Especially Polly and Sam are notable standouts, which made me feel for the characters and what they were going through, although the rest of the cast is great as well. Tommy himself might sound a bit too much like a typical wise guy instead of a normal cab driver, but that kind of fits his personality in the remake more than the original. Now, even though it's called the Definitive Edition, there's still a couple of weird bugs that turn up every once in a while. Nothing game-breaking or any of the sort, but the ragdoll physics sometimes cause some weird glitches, especially when you take out people in different spots than the developers expected you to do. Like we can see in this example on the boats, but that's about as bad as it gets, so all in all, it's completely playable without any major issues.
Jeez. She felt funny.
So at the end of the day, the question of course is, which version is better? Is Mafia Definitive Edition truly the Definitive Edition? And the answer to that is a tough one, because it depends on what you value. If it's gameplay over story, I'd personally go for the original simply because it's harder, more visceral, but most of all because you have more control over the actual game. Being able to shoot at wheels, windows, or enemy drivers while in the car makes those segments way more engaging. Having the enemy AI change up their patterns during the combat sections makes those way more dangerous, surprising, and exhilarating. You're actually playing a game. You always feel like you're in control and you can bend the rules of the environments to your will. Tommy's reluctancy to join the Salieri family and the emphasis on greed over values might seem more realistic and grounded than its remake counterpart, but it also comes at a cost because most scenes and characters feel a little bit disjointed. You might be in control of the game, but you also always feel like you're playing one. And this is where the Definitive Edition comes in, because when it comes to story, character development, and nuance, I have to give it to that one. Greatly expanding on certain scenes and characters was a brilliant choice that makes you care way more about what's going on, how everyone became who they are, and what's happening to them. You're rooting for the entire cast, and even the villains get their time to shine. But at the end of the day, in all honesty, you can't go wrong with either of these titles. They're both fantastic in their own way, and I highly recommend you try them both. When it comes to open worlds or cities in games that actually serve the story and enhance it instead of obstructing it with meaningless tasks and chores, there are only 4 games I can come up with that did it perfectly. The original Mafia and the Definitive Edition being 2 of them, but also the brilliant sequel Mafia 2, and the game called Sleeping Dogs, another fantastic semi-open world game that focuses on the triad crime syndicates in Hong Kong. All 4 of these games are special, unique, and something many current games should take a lesson from. I had a fantastic time going back to them, and I can't wait to see how they tackle this next year in the old country. I hope Hangar 13 looks to the success of Mafia Definitive Edition, opposed to what they did with Mafia 3, and makes the open world in the old country serve the story again. Give us a linear narrative and forget about Ubisoft. But needless to say, I'll be there day one and I cannot wait. I absolutely love these games and they deserve all the attention anyone can give them. However, while we wait for the old country, we've got a couple of fantastic months ahead of us. Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, Avowed, and Assassin's Creed Shadows all release in February, and I can't wait to play and cover them on this channel. But before we get to those, I need to share something highly embarrassing with you. And that'll happen next week, because from here on out, unless my own body tries to kill me again, you'll find a new video on this channel every Saturday. And next time, I'll dive deep into the world of Obsidian and Knights of the Old Republic 2, while telling you the deepest, darkest secret of my entire life. So until then, have a great week, my friends.